Hey guys, so in this video I just want to go over briefly some really important areas of the brain with you using this 3D model here. So what you're looking at here is kind of what you would picture, right, if you were imagining what a brain looks like, or if you Google, a brain, these are usually the kind of the images that pop up. But really, what you're looking at is just the cerebral cortex, which is kind of the outer covering of the brain. And there's a lot more stuff that's going on underneath, which we'll look at a little bit later on. But the cerebral cortex is a really important part of the brain. And so we'll go over this one first, and then we'll kind of take a look inside and see what's going on there. So the cerebral cortex, this outer covering of our brain, gets divided into four different areas, or what we would call lobes. You've got the frontal lobe, you've got the parietal lobe, you've got the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. And each one of these regions is kind of tasked with doing different jobs. So we'll start off with the frontal lobe, which is this kind of frontal region here of the brain. And we like to call this kind of the executive center. And if you think about what it means to be an executive of like a company, for example, that means that, the executive is a person who makes all the decisions and they're kind of in charge. And that's kind of what the frontal lobe is. You make all of your decisions in the frontal lobe. So when you decided to click on this video and watched it, that that happened in the frontal lobe area of your brain. So all decision making, right? Whether it's a good decision, bad decision, if you're like, oh man, I wish I would have never opened this video, right? Doesn't matter. Happening in the frontal lobe. The other thing that goes on in the frontal lobe is planning. So whether it's, what are you're going to plan to do after watching this video, or what are you going to plan to do over the weekend, or what are you planning to do for the rest of your life in terms of your goals and your degree and your career and all of that stuff, right? Planning. And then it can be very short term, like what am I going to have for lunch, or it can be really, really long term, like 4 or 5, 7 years from now. I want to have this degree, and then I want to, do this and all of that. So we're pretty complex creatures in terms of our ability and how far ahead we can plan. And so that happens in the frontal lobe. The other thing that occurs in the frontal lobe is impulse control. So whether or not you're able to, whether or not you're good at impulse control, meaning do you just do whatever comes to mind, or do you actually sit down and think and be like, maybe this is not a good idea. Maybe I shouldn't do this. Or you think it through and you're like, yeah, no, this is a good idea, right? So impulse control happens in the frontal lobe. Um, Substance is affected. So if you think about like somebody who's drunk, right, and then they get behind the wheel and they drive, they're not making a good decision. They're making an impulsive decision. And one of the reasons that happens when we're drunk, or we're taking any other kind of substance that depresses or brings down our nervous system function, it kind of suppresses this area of the brain, and then now we don't have good impulse control. And so a lot of times people make bad decisions when they're drunk because this area of the brain is being suppressed. And then lastly, we think that this is probably also where consciousness happens, even though, with consciousness, it's a little bit more complex and we're not even 100% sure where it happens, or what it is and all of that. So we think that consciousness is probably also happening here in the frontal lobe. All right, so that's the frontal area. This kind of top backside area of your brain is called the parietal lobe. And your parietal lobe processes sensory information, but only for the senses of taste, smell, and like feel, like touch and feel. So anytime you're tasting or smelling something, even though you're eating it or you're smelling it through your nose, that information, those chemicals attached to receptors in your nose and in your mouth, it's your taste buds, and then they, through neurons, they turn that into an electrical signal, send that up to your parietal lobe, and then your parietal lobe tells you, hey, this is what you're tasting, this is what you're smelling. And then you make the subjective kind of decision, or you kind of judge whether or not you like it or not, right? So like, this tastes really, really great, or this smells really, really good, or yeah, this is disgusting, right? But that's because your parietal lobe is processing that information for you and tells you, hey, this tastes sour, this tastes sweet, this tastes bitter, this is a disgusting smell, this is a really nice smell. That all happens in the parietal lobe. In the back of your brain, you've got the occipital lobe, which is the primary visual cortex of your brain. So this is where all of your visual information is being processed. So even though your eyes capture the light that's reflecting off of things, again, through neurons, it creates an electrical signal, shoots that back to the occipital lobe. Your occipital lobe then kind of unpackages that neural signal and tells you, hey, or allows you to perceive what it is that you're seeing. We'll talk about all these processes later on in a couple of weeks when we get into sensation, but this is the area of the brain that really allows that process to happen. This is where your visual information is being processed. And then on the side of your brain here is the temporal lobe, and the other thing that's kind of on the side of our head is our ears. And so the temporal lobe is all about processing auditory information. So this is all the stuff that you hear. Again, when you hear things, it's sound waves that are kind of traveling through the air. They're captured by your ears, and then you have receptors, special receptors inside of your ears that take that information, turn it into a neural signal, send it to the temporal lobe, and then the temporal lobe unpackages it and gives you the perception of what it is that you're hearing. All right, and so those are the four major lobes and kind of their function. Now let's take a look inside, and for that we'll go ahead and we'll flip this around. And so you see you've got a lot of stuff going on. The cerebral cortex is really just the outer covering. And I'm sorry for all these numbers, but I'll try to zoom in on every little. There's only four major parts that we're going to kind of look at, and I'll zoom into those and kind of explain them. So what we're going to be looking at is four structures that kind of make up what's called the limbic system. All right, the first being the thalamus, and the thalamus, I'll have to, there it is this kind of gray structure. Here, let me click on number 13. Yep, that's the thalamus. Right, is this big kind of structure here inside here. That's that little gray structure underneath this pink one. And what the thalamus does is it's a relay station. It's a relay station for all of your sensory information. It kind of acts like I would say like a post office. So all of your sensory information, with the exception of smell, but all of your sensory information, so visual, taste, touch, and hearing. That information first goes to the thalamus. The thalamus looks at it and says, oh, okay, you need to go to this region of the brain. You need to go to this area of the brain. And then it just it kind of organizes it and shoots it to where it needs to go. It directs it to where it needs to go. In that sense, it's kind of a post office where everything gets dumped in the thalamus, and then it makes sure that that information gets to the right area, so that all your visual stuff goes to the occipital lobe. It wouldn't help if visual stuff went to the temporal lobe. Temporal lobe wouldn't know what to do with it. So the thalamus kind of takes that information, says, okay, your touch, your heat, right? Like whether we feel cold or warm. Okay, that's kind of a touch sensation that deals with our skin. That goes up to the parietal lobe. So that's what the thalamus kind of does. All right. The next area we're going to look at, I have to move this around a little bit, is the hypothalamus, which is right here at number 21, and it's this structure right here. The hypothalamus, I always tell students, you can conceptualize or think about the hypothalamus in terms of it being almost like a thermostat for your entire body. Not just in terms of thermostat, like it maintains your temperature. It definitely does that. So the hypothalamus makes sure that there's a certain baseline in terms of a body temperature or just a temperature that you are comfortable at. If it gets too high, you feel hot, and then the hypothalamus will motivate some behaviors to get you to cool down. It'll things that it can control is like, I can make you sweat to try to cool you down, but I'm also going to motivate you. Hey, get inside somewhere, turn on some AC, get cool, right? Or vice versa. If it gets too low, now all of a sudden you feel cold. You're going to start shivering to try to kind of warm up, but it also is going to motivate you to go, put on some more clothes or get somewhere warm. But it does this for everything, not just temperature. This monitors your calorie levels. So if that gets too low, you're going to feel hungry. This is the part of the brain that makes you feel hungry. Once you started eating and you're full, this is the part of the brain that makes you feel satiated, that you're good. You can stop eating now. If you're thirsty, it's going to motivate you to go drink. This deals with sexual behaviors. So if you're horny, this is going to motivate you to do some kind of sexual behavior to get rid of that. So this part of the brain monitors everything in your body, and it wants to ensure that you stay at a certain baseline, that you're comfortable. And so anytime that goes out of whack, either too high or too low, it's going to motivate some behaviors to get you back onto your baseline. And it does this because it sits right on top of what's called the pituitary gland, which is right here. So the hypothalamus sits right on top of the pituitary gland, which is kind of your major gland in the body, which kind of directs all the other glands in releasing certain hormones and all of that. And so the hypothalamus tells the pituitary gland, hey, this is what we need. And then the pituitary gland releases a hormone, and then all the other glands in your body kind of follow suit and they release certain hormones. And that's kind of how the hypothalamus indirectly controls everything through the pituitary gland, which is right here, number 20. All right. Last two, also right next to each other. Let me make sure I get this. So number 1 is the amygdala, which is this little pink area. It's like really almost like a pea-sized structure. And this plays a couple of roles, but primarily the amygdala, what it's really known for and what it's really important for, deals with our emotional responses. Specifically, I mean, it deals with all emotional responses, so any emotions that you have and how you usually respond, whether you're happy, you're sad, you're angry, you're afraid, you're disgusted, whatever it might be. The amygdala plays a really big role with our emotions and our emotional responses. But specifically, the areas that it really deals with is with things like fear. Things like fear and anger and anxiety. That's where the amygdala plays a really, really major role in our emotional responses to those things, specifically fear. That's a really big one, and anxiety. But we'll touch on this one again when we get into the emotions. But that's kind of what the amygdala is for. The next area and the last area is the hippocampus, which is this kind of blue region right here. Hippocampus is really important for your memory formation. So the hippocampus is the structure of the brain that allows you to form new memories. And so all the memories that you have in your brain, you have because of your hippocampus, or because your hippocampus is functioning. If you were to damage this area, you probably wouldn't be forming any more new memories. If you think of like a good example, there's a movie, 50 First Dates, where she kind of she got in a car accident. The main character got in an accident, and she couldn't form any new memories. She could remember everything up to that accident, but then nothing else. That's kind of a good way to conceptualize what damaging your hippocampus is like. Another example of this is somebody being blackout drunk. The reason why that happens, why somebody gets to a point where they black out, is not they're not passed out, because people who are blacked out, they can still do things. They can still, they're still, running around and probably drinking more and just doing whatever, but they just don't remember anymore. And that's because you get to a point where you've consumed so much alcohol that the hippocampus shuts down. And so now you're no longer creating any new memories. So that's the explanation for that phenomenon. So the hippocampus is very important in creating memories. Now, excuse me, one thing I just want to add, you can see that the amygdala, this one region, is connected to the hippocampus. And so one other thing that the amygdala does is it attaches emotions to our memories. Depending on whatever that memory was like, that experience for you, the amygdala is going to take whatever that emotion was you're feeling at the time and attach it to that memory, so that anytime you remember that, you're going to feel that same kind of emotion. So we all have memories where when we think about them, we get really happy, or we get really sad, or we get really angry. And the reason that happens is because the amygdala attaches that emotion to that memory, and now it's kind of there forever. All right, and so those are the 4 parts of the limbic system. We got the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. And these are all areas of the brain that are going to come up repeatedly over the semester as we deal with certain areas and certain concepts that they're related with. So you'll probably hear this or see this information over and over again. All right, thank you for watching.